It all began on a warm Saturday afternoon, when the city streets buzzed with the rhythm of everyday life. Vendors shouted out prices for roasted corn and hot dogs. Children darted through the park chasing each other with laughter. And families strolled lazily along the sidewalks, enjoying the rare calmness of the weekend. But peace can shatter in an instant, and what happened next would leave the crowd speechless and the internet ablaze. Without warning, the sharp wail of police sirens cut through the air, slicing the calm atmosphere into shreds. A patrol car sped down the block, brakes screeching as it lurched to a stop near a small corner convenience store. Shoppers froze mid-step, turning their heads toward the flashing lights. And then it happened. The driver's door slammed open and out stormed a tall, broad-shouldered officer, his face twisted in anger, eyes zeroing in on a single man. The target was a black man in his late 30s, casually dressed in jeans and a fitted black t-shirt, who had just stepped out of the corner shop with a small grocery bag in hand. He hadn't even taken 3 steps onto the sidewalk when the officer charged at him like a predator closing in on prey. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the officer barked, "Stop right there! Hands where I can see them!" The man froze, confusion flashing across his face. But before he could respond, the officer shoved him hard against the hood of the squad car, twisting his arm mercilessly behind his back. The metallic clang of his body hitting the car's surface echoed down the street. Gasps erupted. A mother covered her child's eyes. Someone whispered, "What's he doing? That guy didn't do anything." And yet, the officer pressed on, his voice loud, accusatory, and full of hostility. The man he was holding down didn't resist, didn't fight, didn't even raise his voice. Instead, his calm demeanor stood in shocking contrast to the officer's aggression. He looked around, scanning the growing crowd with steady eyes that seemed to say, "I know this isn't right, but I'm not going to let it break me." What no one in that moment realized was that the man being slammed and treated like a criminal was not just any passerby. He was a decorated U.S. Navy SEAL, a man who had served in some of the most dangerous parts of the world, who had stared death in the face countless times, while protecting the very country whose law enforcement now degraded him on a public street. His strong frame bore the quiet strength of someone trained to remain composed under pressure, someone who understood discipline and restraint better than anyone. But here, in his own city, in front of his own people, he was being humiliated for one reason alone: because of the color of his skin. Phones began to rise from every angle. A ripple went through the bystanders as they realized this wasn't just another heated moment. It was something much bigger. The familiar sound of a camera shutter clicked, followed by the red glow of recording buttons. Within seconds, at least a dozen phones were pointed at the scene, capturing every shove, every insult, every ounce of unnecessary force. Murmurs turned into angry whispers. A young woman at the edge of the crowd clutched her phone tightly and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "He didn't do anything. Why are you treating him like that?" Her voice carried the frustration that everyone else felt, but hadn't yet dared to speak. Still, the officer ignored the crowd. His grip tightened, pressing the man harder against the hood as if trying to break him. "You match the description of a suspect," he barked, not even listening when the man calmly replied, "Sir, I just came out of the store." The more the officer forced his narrative, the more obvious it became to the witnesses that this wasn't about justice. It was about power, about control, and about prejudice. The energy shifted. People weren't just watching anymore. They were growing restless, voices rising louder with every second. Yet through it all, the man remained steady. His breathing was controlled, his eyes unflinching, his voice even. This wasn't the reaction of a guilty person, nor was it the panic of an ordinary man under threat. It was the discipline of someone trained to face chaos head-on, without losing himself. The irony was thick, though. The officer who claimed to be protecting the community was, at that very moment, dishonoring one of the very people who had risked his life to protect the nation. And then the whispers spread quickly through the crowd like fire in dry grass. Someone muttered, "Wait, I think that guy's military." Another voice chimed in, "Yeah, I've seen him before. He's a Navy SEAL. Heads began to turn, eyes widened, and the crowd buzzed with disbelief. A sense of injustice boiled, hotter in their chests as they realized the truth. The man being pinned and humiliated wasn't just a bystander, he was a hero. The officer had no idea, of course. To him, this was just another stop, another suspect to control, another statistic. But to the crowd, this was no longer about one man and one cop. This was about the ugly face of discrimination playing out in real time. And the worst mistake the officer could have made was forgetting that this was 2025, where every hand in that crowd carried a phone, every camera was rolling, and every second was being preserved for the world to see. What happened in the next few moments would change everything, not only for the officer and the man pinned to the car, but for the city itself. The officer's grip tightened as if he wanted to crush the man's arm, his voice booming across the street. "You fit the description of a suspect in a robbery. Don't move." His tone wasn't investigative. It was accusatory, full of hostility, as though the verdict had already been decided. The man tried to remain calm, his voice low but firm. "Officer, please, let me show you my ID." But instead of listening, the officer shoved him harder, slamming his chest against the hood so violently that the sound echoed like a hammer on steel. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A child cried out in fear. A woman screamed, "Stop! He didn't do anything!" The tension snapped into something far more dangerous. Rage was building in the air. People weren't just watching anymore. They were witnessing an injustice unfold right before their eyes. A man in a baseball cap stepped forward cautiously, phone held high, and shouted, "You've got the wrong guy. Look at him. He's not resisting." But the officer spun around just enough to bark, "Back off. Everyone stay back." His hand hovered dangerously close to his holster, sending a wave of fear through the onlookers. Nobody wanted violence, but the officer's aggression was fanning the flames of anger in the crowd. The man pinned to the car, though, didn't resist. His calmness was unnerving. He wasn't panicking, wasn't shouting for help, just breathing, steadily, as though his training had prepared him for moments like this. That composure only made the officer look worse. It was clear to everyone around that this wasn't the behavior of a criminal. This was the patience of someone who had nothing to hide. He repeated again, "Check my wallet, please. It will tell you who I am." The officer ignored him, doubling down. "You think I'm stupid? You think I'll let you trick me?" His words dripped with arrogance, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Murmurs turned to accusations. "This is racism," one woman shouted. Another man raised his phone higher and yelled, "We're recording everything. You can't hide this." Dozens of cameras now glowed red, capturing the unfolding scene from every angle. The officer's posture was rigid, but his voice trembled with frustration, knowing the crowd was turning against him. Then it happened. A voice from the crowd pierced through the tension like a lightning bolt. A young man near the front shouted, "He's a Navy SEAL. You're making a mistake." The words echoed across the block, stopping some people in their tracks. Others gasped, whispering, "Did he say Navy SEAL?" The crowd buzzed with sudden realization, but the officer only sneered, trying to maintain control of the situation. "I don't care who he says he is," the officer barked. "He matches the suspect. That's all I need." But those words were gasoline on fire. The crowd erupted. A chorus of voices shouted back at him, their anger swelling louder with each second. "You're profiling him. This is abuse of power. Let him go." The energy shifted into something explosive. People weren't afraid anymore. They were furious. And yet, through it all, the man under the officer's grip remained calm, his steady eyes locking with different faces in the crowd as if silently reassuring them. "Don't act out. Don't lose control. I've got this." It was a surreal scene. An officer drunk on authority, a man radiating calm strength despite humiliation, and a crowd that had transformed from silent witnesses into defenders demanding justice. The chanting grew louder. "Let him go! Let him go!" Over and over, the words pounded like drums in the air, echoing against the buildings. The officer's jaw tightened, sweat beading on his forehead. His eyes darted nervously between the man he held down and the crowd that was growing more hostile by the second. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just in control. He was on trial, right there on the street, judged by dozens of eyes and recorded by dozens of phones. The man took a slow breath and spoke clearly, his voice carrying authority without shouting. "Officer, I am not your suspect. Look at my ID and you'll see the truth." His words cut through the chants, commanding attention like a leader addressing a unit in the middle of chaos. The crowd quieted for a moment, hanging on his every word. He wasn't pleading, he was stating fact, confident in his own integrity. The officer, however, was too blinded by pride and prejudice to step back. He tightened his grip again, muttering under his breath, "You think you're above the law? Not today." That line only made the people around him explode again. A woman shoved her phone inches from his face, yelling, "You're going viral tonight, officer. The whole world is going to see this." The threat wasn't empty. In that moment, dozens of videos were already being live-streamed to social media, spreading the scene beyond the block, beyond the city, into the hands of thousands watching online in real time. The officer had no idea that every second he clung to his false authority was another nail in his own coffin. The man pinned to the car wasn't just defending himself. He was exposing the very system that had judged him the moment he walked out of that store. And the crowd knew it. They weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses to history, and they weren't going to let this moment pass unnoticed. The air crackled with suspense. People leaned forward, phones held high, breath short, waiting to see if the officer would finally check the man's ID, or if this injustice would spiral into something darker. And in that tense silence, the man's calm voice came once more. Low but firm, "Let me prove who I am." The crowd had reached its boiling point when suddenly, the man pinned to the hood shifted his weight just enough to reach into his back pocket. The officer barked, "Don't move! Don't you dare move!" But the man's steady tone cut through the chaos like a blade through the dark. "I am not resisting. I am showing you the truth." Every phone zoomed in, every camera focused as he slowly pulled out a worn leather wallet. His movements were measured, deliberate, like someone who knew the importance of staying calm under fire. With his free hand, he flipped it open and raised a small card into the air. For a heartbeat, the street fell silent. The golden lettering caught the sun, gleaming for everyone to see. The words at the top read, "United States Navy." It wasn't just any identification, it was a military ID. People gasped, voices erupting almost instantly. "Oh my God, he's military," shouted a woman. Another man near the front cried out, "That's a Navy SEAL badge." "He's a SEAL!" The realization spread like lightning, and the crowd's tone shifted from anger to sheer disbelief. The officer's grip faltered for the first time, his eyes darting toward the card. His lips parted as though he might say something, but instead of backing off, he stubbornly muttered, "Anyone can fake an ID. This doesn't prove anything." His words were weak, unconvincing. The crowd roared in outrage. "Fake? Are you kidding me? That's official. Look at it. You're in trouble now." The chants grew stronger, their voices pounding against the officer's pride. The man stood taller now, no longer pressed against the car, his ID still raised high. His calmness was unshakable, almost intimidating in itself. His voice carried a quiet authority, the kind only forged through years of discipline. "I have served in combat zones overseas. I've defended this country with my life. And now in my own neighborhood, I'm treated like a criminal." The words echoed down the block, hitting everyone with the force of truth. For the crowd, this wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about all the times injustice had played out without witnesses. This time, however, there were witnesses. Dozens of them. Every angle, every shove, every word. The officer's face flushed red, but he doubled down out of pride, muttering, "Protocol. We still have to verify. Suspect matching description." But his voice was drowned out. The people weren't listening to him anymore. They were listening to the Navy SEAL. A middle-aged man in the crowd, a veteran himself, pushed closer and shouted, "You don't know who you're messing with." "That man's a hero. He fought for this flag while you sit here abusing your badge." His words were met with claps and cheers. Another woman yelled, "Shame, shame." and the chant began to ripple through the block until dozens were chanting in unison. The officer's confidence cracked. He wasn't just dealing with a suspect anymore. He was facing a community united, a crowd unwilling to let this injustice slide. His eyes flicked nervously between the ID and the cameras, his posture stiff but uncertain. The man, this Navy SEAL, never raised his voice, never flinched, never struck back. His control only magnified the officer's misconduct, making it clear who held true strength in that moment. The crowd surged closer, phones raised high like a wall of evidence, and one bystander shouted the words that sealed the officer's fate. "It's all on video. The world's going to see this." The officer froze. In that instant, the weight of what was happening finally sank in. This wasn't going to disappear. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. His actions were already captured, already broadcast, already spreading beyond his control. The man lowered his ID slightly, his steady gaze sweeping across the crowd. He didn't look angry. He looked resolute, like a soldier standing his ground without firing a single shot. "This is what it means," he said clearly, "to live with dignity even when others try to take it away." The words landed heavily, as though they belonged in a speech rather than a heated confrontation. For many in the crowd, it was the first time they had witnessed someone humiliated publicly, yet rise taller through restraint and courage. The officer's hand twitched near his belt, but he didn't dare escalate further. Not with the cameras, not with the ID in plain sight, and not with the chance of dozens of witnesses shaking the ground beneath his authority. He had already lost control. The story had shifted, and now he was the suspect, suspected of racism, of abuse of power, of dishonoring the very people he was sworn to serve. In the end, it wasn't the badge or the gun that carried the most power that afternoon. It was the truth. And in the hands of a Navy SEAL, the truth was impossible to silence. The crowd knew it, the officer knew it, and deep down, the entire city would soon know it too, because every second of this injustice was preserved forever in the cameras that never stopped recording. The tension in the air was like a live wire, buzzing, sparking, threatening to snap at any second. The crowd wasn't just restless anymore. They were angry, united, and unafraid to speak out. And at the center of it all, standing tall despite the humiliation he'd endured, was the Navy SEAL. His voice rose above the chaos, firm and commanding, the kind of tone that silences a room even when no one wants to listen. "I've served overseas. I've fought for this flag. And now this is how I'm treated at home?" His words weren't shouted, but they carried a weight that settled heavily on every ear in the street. The crowd erupted. "That's right," someone yelled. Another voice joined in. "He's a hero, not a criminal." The chants returned, louder than ever. "Let him go! Let him go!" The officer who had started it all was visibly rattled, his hands trembling slightly, though he tried to mask it with stiff posture. He had underestimated not only the man he was handling, but also the power of the witnesses surrounding him. Suddenly, more sirens wailed in the distance, and 2 additional squad cars pulled up, lights flashing. Reinforcements had arrived. Doors slammed and several officers approached quickly, their eyes scanning the crowd, their hands resting on their belts. For a moment, fear rippled through the bystanders. Were they about to see the situation spiral completely out of control? But the presence of more officers didn't intimidate the crowd. In fact, it only amplified their determination. Voices grew louder, phones pointed higher, and one woman screamed, "Don't you dare touch him again! We're all recording this." The first officer, red-faced and cornered by his own arrogance, gestured wildly at the SEAL and barked to his colleagues, "He matches the suspect." He refused to comply, but his words fell flat. The other officers glanced at the military ID still in the man's hand, then at the angry crowd encircling them. It was clear to them that this wasn't just a routine stop gone wrong. This was a disaster, and they had walked into the middle of it. The SEAL didn't flinch. He straightened his back, his presence commanding without aggression, his voice steady as ever. "Gentlemen," he said, looking directly at the arriving officers, "I am not resisting. I have identified myself. You can see my credentials. What you are witnessing is abuse, plain and simple." His calmness in the face of chaos had a disarming effect. Even those officers who had arrived ready to enforce control paused, unsure of how to proceed under the heat of so many eyes and lenses. The crowd wasn't about to let this moment pass quietly. A man in a veteran's cap pushed forward and shouted, "You don't touch him! He's earned more respect than any of you can imagine." A wave of agreement surged through the people. Another woman cried, "Justice! Justice!" And within seconds the chant spread like wildfire. The entire block echoed with the sound of dozens of voices demanding fairness, demanding accountability, demanding that this man be treated with the dignity he deserved. The officer who had slammed the seal against the car earlier was now shrinking under the weight of his own actions. Sweat dripped down his temple, his voice cracking as he tried to assert control. "Everyone back! This is official police business." But nobody moved. If anything, the wall of people pressed closer, their phones documenting every stammer, every nervous glance. The truth was undeniable. The man he had targeted wasn't just innocent, he was a hero. And worse for him, that truth was being captured from every angle. The Navy SEAL finally lowered his ID and tucked it carefully back into his wallet, then turned his gaze back to the officer who had manhandled him. "You can try to justify this any way you want," he said firmly, his words cutting through the chants like a blade. "But the world has already seen who you are. You didn't see a citizen? You didn't see a man. You saw a color. That's why we're here." A hush fell over the crowd as the weight of his words settled. Even those who had been shouting grew quiet, their eyes locked on him. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for everyone who had ever felt targeted, dismissed, or degraded. The moment was bigger than the officer, bigger than the crowd, bigger even than the SEAL himself. It was a reflection of a truth too many had lived with for too long. The new officers exchanged uneasy glances. They could feel the tide had shifted. This wasn't a situation they could spin or contain. The chants began again, louder than ever. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" The officer at the center of it all seemed smaller now, his earlier aggression replaced by desperation. He knew his badge couldn't shield him from the consequences that were already unfolding. And still, through it all, the Navy SEAL stood calm, his dignity unbroken. He hadn't raised his fists, hadn't lashed out, hadn't once lost control. Yet somehow he had taken command of the entire street. His strength measured not in force, but in restraint. To the crowd, he was no longer just a soldier who had served overseas. He was a living example of resilience, a man who showed what true power really looked like when faced with injustice. What had begun as a one-sided act of humiliation had transformed into something entirely different. A moment of reckoning. Captured in real time, unstoppable, undeniable, unforgettable. The moment the crowd realized what had happened, that a decorated Navy SEAL had been slammed, humiliated and racially profiled on the street by a cop, the energy shifted into something unstoppable. Phones weren't just recording anymore. They were streaming live. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation began to spread across social media like wildfire. Hashtags popped up instantly. Headlines on local news channels changed mid-broadcast as reporters scrambled to cover the breaking story. The officer thought he could control one man, but he had just lost control of an entire narrative, one that was spreading faster than he could ever imagine. The first video to go viral captured the exact moment the SEAL raised his military ID and calmly announced who he was. The crowd's gasp, the chants of "let him go," and the officer's stubborn refusal to admit his mistake. It was all there, crystal clear. Within an hour, millions of views piled up. Comments poured in from across the country. "This is unacceptable. How can a man who fought for this country be treated like this? This cop just destroyed his own career." By the time the officer returned to the station that evening, his name was already trending nationwide. Screenshots of his face spread across platforms, tagged with words like "racist cop" and "abuse of power." The department scrambled to respond, issuing a vague statement about reviewing the incident, but it was too late. The world had already seen what happened. The damage was done. Meanwhile, the Navy SEAL himself avoided the spotlight as much as possible. He didn't rush to do interviews or chase media attention. When reporters finally caught up with him outside his home, he stood before the cameras with the same calmness he had displayed that day. His words were simple, but they cut deep. I don't want sympathy. I don't want to be a headline. I just want fairness. I fought for freedom overseas. Should be able to walk in my own neighborhood without being treated like an enemy. Those words resonated far beyond the city. Veterans organizations began to release statements in support of him, demanding accountability for the officer's behavior. Civil rights groups amplified the videos, pointing out the painful irony that a man who had risked everything for his country had been targeted and demeaned because of the color of his skin. Online, people debated late into the night about justice, racism, and respect for those who serve. The officer's fate unraveled quickly. Internal Affairs launched an investigation within 24 hours, not because they wanted to, but because the public outcry left them no choice. The mayor held a press conference, his face grim as he called the incident deeply troubling. Behind the scenes, whispers swirled that the officer would be suspended, maybe even fired. But none of that mattered to the millions of people who had already made up their minds. He wasn't just guilty in the court of law, he was guilty in the court of public opinion, and that sentence would follow him forever. As for the seal, he became an unexpected symbol. He never raised his fist, never cursed, never retaliated, and yet his quiet strength had dismantled an officer's authority in front of hundreds. People began calling him the calm storm online, praising how he stood tall without violence. Teachers shared the video with their students as a lesson in dignity and courage. Veterans saluted him in posts, calling him a brother who had represented their community with honor. His story wasn't just about racism. It was about restraint, integrity, and the power of truth. And yet, he never asked for any of it. In a follow-up interview weeks later, he said, "I don't want to be remembered as the man who exposed a cop. I want to be remembered as a man who showed that even in the face of hate, you can choose dignity." Those words echoed like a challenge to everyone watching, that the fight for justice doesn't always require fists or anger. It requires persistence, patience, and courage. The videos of that day remain online, still circulating, still inspiring conversations, still reminding people of what happened when one officer tried to break a man who couldn't be broken. For the officer, it became the end of his career, his reputation shattered beyond repair. For the Navy SEAL, it was another kind of battle, one he never asked for, but faced with the same calm resolve that had carried him through war zones. And for the crowd who stood their ground, it was a moment they would never forget. They weren't just witnesses, they became the amplifiers of truth, the reason the world saw what happened. Without them, it could have been just another silent injustice. But because they stood firm, because they recorded, because they refused to look away, the truth lived on. The hook of the story wasn't just that a racist cop had slammed a Navy SEAL. The hook was that seconds later, the crowd captured everything, and in doing so, they reminded the world that when truth is exposed, no badge, no arrogance, no abuse of power can hide from it.